Shadow intimidated everyone he crossed paths with. The moment Marcus and his imposing canine companion entered the veterinary clinic, it was immediately clear this was no ordinary dog, a fact the vet recognized instantly. Without hesitation, the veterinarian excused himself and contacted the authorities, while Marcus waited in the reception area, completely oblivious to the situation unfolding behind closed doors. When Marcus spotted police vehicles pulling up outside, his instincts kicked in. Grabbing Shadow's leash, he considered making a hasty exit. Though he didn't understand why the vet would call the police, he couldn't risk losing the dog he'd grown so attached to. But it was already too late. Officers blocked the exit before he could leave. Marcus stood protectively in front of Shadow, ready to defend his right to keep him. However, as the officers began explaining the situation, Marcus's defiance gradually transformed into shock. Everything suddenly became clear. Shadow was no ordinary dog. How could he have missed the signs for so long? Marcus hadn't planned on adopting a dog that fateful Saturday morning. He had only gone to the farmer's market to pick up fresh vegetables and local honey, items on the list Emma had carefully written out for him. The twins were at their grandparents' for the weekend, giving Marcus and Emma a rare moment of peace in their otherwise chaotic lives. It was while wandering between stalls of handcrafted goods and local produce that Marcus first noticed the makeshift pen tucked away in a corner of the market. Most shoppers passed by without a second glance, but something drew Marcus closer. Perhaps the unusual quiet emanating from what should have been a noisy collection of animals. The moment he locked eyes with the mysterious animal, something inexplicable happened. Those piercing amber eyes held his gaze for just a moment before the unusual creature, with its distinctively pointed ears, turned away, seemingly disinterested in the human world around him. The dog's coat was sleek and black, with not a single patch of any other color, like a shadow given physical form. "That one just came in yesterday," the vendor said, noticing Marcus's interest. The man's weathered face and shifty eyes did little to inspire confidence. "Nobody wants him, though. Says he looks too mean. Probably end up at the shelter by Monday if nobody takes him." Despite feeling a flicker of apprehension, Marcus found himself drawn closer to the pen. "What breed is he?" he asked, noting the dog's unusual appearance, the hairless patches on his body, contrasting with the sleek fur elsewhere, the prominent pointed ears, and that unnervingly intelligent gaze. "Some kind of mix, I guess," the vendor shrugged, clearly uninterested in the animal's lineage. "Mexican hairless, maybe, with something else? Does it matter? $50 and he's yours. Otherwise, he's shelter-bound, and you know what happens to scary-looking dogs at shelters." Marcus knew he would take this dog home for two reasons. First, he had already mentally named the magnificent black animal Shadow. Second, the vendor selling the dogs from a makeshift corner stall clearly had little regard for their welfare. Deep down, Marcus knew he should consult with his wife Emma before bringing home such an intimidating animal, especially with their 4-year-old twins to consider. Who could predict how this mysterious creature might behave around children? But time was running out as the vendor began packing up for the day. Unable to bear the thought of Shadow being euthanized, Marcus made an impulsive decision. Anticipating Emma would refuse if consulted, Marcus handed over the cash and led the remarkably quiet and obedient Shadow to his truck. Throughout the drive home, the peculiar dog remained eerily calm, silently watching the world pass by through the window. It wasn't until they pulled into the driveway that Marcus realized Shadow hadn't made a single sound since they met, behavior unlike any dog he'd ever encountered. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" Marcus murmured, glancing at his new companion. Shadow merely turned those amber eyes toward him, unblinking and unfathomable. Marcus wondered if Shadow had received specialized training in his previous life. Perhaps he'd been a police or military dog who hadn't quite made the final cut. This level of composure simply couldn't be normal for an ordinary canine. Most dogs would be nervous in a new environment, whining or barking at unfamiliar sounds and scents. Shadow, however, seemed to observe everything with an almost supernatural detachment. As Marcus stepped onto the porch with Shadow, he could feel Emma's disapproving gaze through the window. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she took in the sight of the imposing animal at her husband's side. Fortunately, their twins, Leo and Lucas, reached the door first, bursting through with the boundless energy only 4-year-olds possess. "A dog! You got us a dog!" they shouted in unison, their excitement palpable. Marcus tightened his grip on the leash and held his breath. Would Shadow suddenly become aggressive around such loud, unpredictable children? Emma hurried behind the boys, her concern evident in her expression. "Marcus, what is this?" she asked, her voice tight with worry as she pulled the twins back slightly. Shadow, however, remained completely unbothered, handling the chaotic welcome with the same eerie calm that had characterized him since their meeting. Despite his intimidating appearance, Leo and Lucas were ecstatic, jumping around and declaring Shadow the coolest dog ever, while the animal maintained his serene demeanor. "His name is Shadow," Marcus explained, watching with relief as the dog allowed the twins to cautiously pet him. "He's very well behaved." Though Emma's initial shock made it difficult for her to maintain her anger, she was genuinely upset. Once the twins were distracted with showing Shadow their toys, Emma pulled Marcus into the kitchen. "How could you make such a significant decision without consulting me?" she demanded, keeping her voice low but intense. "What were you thinking bringing home a dog like that to be around our children, from a random vendor at a farmer's market no less? We know nothing about this animal's history or temperament." "The guy was going to take him to a kill shelter," Marcus explained, feeling a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. "You should have seen the conditions, Emma. I couldn't just leave him there." "So you decided to bring him into our home, around our children, without even a phone call to discuss it?" After Emma had expressed her concerns, Marcus apologized sincerely for his impulsive decision and explained the entire situation. When she learned that Shadow would likely have been euthanized, Emma's anger subsided somewhat. She admitted that despite her initial impression, there was something intriguing about Shadow. She just worried about having him around the energetic twins. "There's something different about him," she conceded, watching as Shadow sat patiently while the boys showed him their toy collection. "I've never seen a dog so composed around children." They agreed that supervising the boys around Shadow would be prudent, at least initially. To their relief, Shadow quickly proved himself to be remarkably well behaved around the family. Nothing seemed to disturb his calm demeanor, and his intimidating appearance had the added benefit of making him an excellent deterrent to potential intruders. When Marcus or Emma walked Shadow through the neighborhood, other dog owners, joggers, and pedestrians gave them a wide berth. Though the couple found this reaction somewhat uncomfortable, Shadow appeared completely indifferent to others' fear of him. "He's actually very gentle," Marcus would call out to neighbors who crossed the street at the sight of them approaching. Few believed him, and fewer still were willing to come close enough to test his claim. Mrs. Harding, their elderly neighbor, was one of the few exceptions. "What a magnificent creature," she had remarked upon meeting Shadow for the first time. "There's wisdom in those eyes, ancient wisdom." Marcus had laughed it off as the fanciful observation of a lonely widow, but later he found himself pondering her words. After nearly a month of living with the family, Shadow's stoic nature remained unchanged. Marcus couldn't help feeling uneasy about how the dog seemed almost entirely devoid of emotion. Nothing upset him, nor did anything excite him. He never barked at the mailman, never growled at strange noises in the night, never wagged his tail when the twins played with him. He simply observed, with those penetrating amber eyes that sometimes seemed to look through people rather than at them. This unusual behavior prompted Marcus to schedule a veterinary appointment to have Shadow thoroughly examined. In the days leading up to the appointment, Marcus conducted his own research. He scoured dog breed websites, forums for exotic pet owners, and even academic articles about canine behavior. But nothing quite matched Shadow's unique characteristic. "Maybe he's not even a dog," Lucas suggested one evening, his imagination running wild as always. Maybe he's a wolf or a secret government experiment. Emma laughed and ruffled his hair. He's definitely a dog, sweetie, just a very special one. But privately, Marcus wasn't entirely convinced. There was something about Shadow that defied explanation. The way he sometimes seemed to stare at empty corners of rooms, or how he would stand perfectly still in the moonlight, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. Though Leo and Lucas begged to accompany them to the vet, Marcus decided it would be better for the boys to remain home, just in case there was something genuinely concerning about Shadow's condition. "Next time," he promised them. "This is just a boring checkup." When they arrived at the clinic that afternoon, the waiting room was unusually crowded. Several appointments had run long, and there had apparently been an emergency case earlier. As Marcus and Shadow waited, he noticed other pet owners discreetly placing their animals back in carriers or tightening their grip on leashes. The fear Shadow inspired was something Marcus had grown accustomed to, but today it would have unexpected consequences. A staff member approached Marcus with an apologetic expression and asked if he and Shadow might wait outside, as some clients had expressed concerns about feeling unsafe. Marcus looked down at his perfectly calm companion and sighed with disappointment. He knew Shadow wouldn't harm anyone unprovoked, but the dog would forever be judged by his appearance. Though frustrated, Marcus complied and led Shadow outside. Just minutes later, a man in a long coat walked past, then stopped abruptly when he noticed Shadow. Unlike most people who encountered the imposing animal, this stranger appeared completely unfazed by Shadow's intimidating presence. "Is this your dog?" the man inquired, his accent suggesting Latin American origins. When Marcus confirmed, the stranger knelt beside Shadow with unusual confidence. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramirez, the senior veterinarian just returning from his break. Though clearly in a hurry, something about Shadow had compelled him to stop. Without elaborating on what had caught his attention, he offered to expedite Marcus's appointment if he agreed to switch to his care instead. The veterinarian's peculiar eagerness struck Marcus as odd, but given the cold weather and uncertain wait time, he accepted the offer. Dr. Ramirez walked briskly into the building, and to Marcus's surprise, he was called in just 10 minutes later. As they passed through the waiting room, Marcus felt the resentful glares from others who realized he'd been allowed to skip ahead. He ignored their looks. These people and their unfounded prejudice toward Shadow meant nothing to him. Inside the examination room, Marcus was taken aback to find Dr. Ramirez dressed in full protective gear, looking more prepared for surgery than a routine checkup. While Marcus attempted to explain his concerns about Shadow's unusual behavior, the vet seemed distracted, methodically examining the dog from every angle and barely acknowledging Marcus's words. "His lack of vocalization concerns me," Marcus explained. "And he never shows any emotion, no excitement, no fear, nothing. Is that normal for any breed?" Dr. Ramirez ran his gloved hands carefully along Shadow's spine, examined his ears, and peered intently at the patterns of fur and hairless patches on his body. He seemed particularly interested in a small mark at the base of Shadow's neck, a pattern of darker skin that Marcus had assumed was just a birthmark. Midway through Marcus's explanation, the veterinarian abruptly interrupted. "I need to check something quickly," he said, then hurried through a side door, closing it firmly behind him. Left alone in the room, Marcus could hear muffled voices beyond the door, but couldn't make out what was being said. He caught fragments, "Certain it's him," and "contact them immediately." That only heightened his anxiety. The brief conversation ended after about 2 minutes. Marcus expected the vet to return immediately, but minutes ticked by with no sign of him. After nearly 15 minutes of waiting, Marcus's patience wore thin. He tried the door handle, only to find it locked. He knocked, then banged more forcefully, calling for someone to let him out. When no one responded, his frustration escalated rapidly. "Why are they treating us this way?" he muttered to Shadow, who remained perfectly calm despite the situation. With mounting anger clouding his judgment, Marcus finally kicked the door open in a sudden burst of rage. To his surprise, Dr. Ramirez stood calmly in the adjacent room, completely unfazed by the damaged door. He was speaking quietly into a phone, which he lowered when Marcus burst in. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with anger and confusion. After calmly checking his watch, the veterinarian finally addressed him. "I've contacted the authorities about you and Shadow. They should be arriving momentarily." Marcus was stunned. "Why would you call the police? What have we done?" "They'll explain the situation better than I can," Dr. Ramirez replied cryptically. "But I can tell you that the dog you call Shadow is not what you think he is." Still pumping with adrenaline from breaking the door, Marcus made a split-second decision. With Shadow following closely behind, he bolted toward the building's exit, determined to escape before losing his beloved companion. His mind raced with possibilities. Was Shadow stolen property? Was he an illegal exotic breed? Whatever the case, Marcus wasn't about to surrender him without understanding why. But it was already too late. Police officers stood blocking the doorway, and an animal control vehicle waited nearby. It was clear they intended to take Shadow. "You're not taking my dog," Marcus shouted, positioning himself protectively in front of Shadow. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me first." One officer approached slowly with palms raised in a calming gesture. "Sir, please listen. The veterinarian has identified your dog, and we need to explain something important to you." The officer revealed that Shadow was not an ordinary dog, but a rare Xoloitzcuintli, a breed sacred in ancient Mayan culture. Shadow's real name was Nocte, and he belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned anthropologist and cultural preservationist from Mérida, Mexico. "This breed holds tremendous cultural significance," the officer explained. "According to Mayan tradition, these dogs guide souls through the afterlife. They were considered sacred animals, bridges between the world of the living and the dead." As the officer spoke, Dr. Ramirez joined them, having removed his protective gear. "The markings on his neck," he explained, "are not natural. They are a ceremonial tattoo, identifying him as a specially trained Xoloitzcuintli used in cultural ceremonies. Dr. Vasquez uses Nocte in educational programs and cultural ceremonies to help preserve indigenous traditions," the officer continued. "He's been specially trained to maintain complete calm in all situations, a characteristic that had puzzled you from the beginning, I imagine." Marcus's mind flashed back to all the unusual behaviors he'd observed: Shadow's silence, his unnerving stillness, his apparent disinterest in typical dog activities. 4 months ago, Nocte was stolen during Dr. Vasquez's lecture tour in the United States, Dr. Ramirez added. "The thieves had apparently sold him to the vendor at the farmer's market. Dr. Vasquez has been searching for him ever since." "But how did you recognize him?" Marcus asked, his anger giving way to bewilderment. "I grew up in Mérida," Dr. Ramirez explained. "I've attended Dr. Vasquez's presentations. When I saw Nocte, as you call him, I knew immediately who he was. These dogs are extremely rare, especially ones with his specific training and markings." As Marcus listened, everything suddenly made sense. Shadow's unusual demeanor, his silence, his unnatural calm. This wasn't just any dog. This was a culturally significant animal with specialized training, stolen from someone who used him to preserve ancient traditions. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow with the realization that he would likely lose his companion. "Dr. Vasquez is already on her way from Mexico," the officer explained. "She'll arrive tomorrow to identify Nocte formally and take him home. In the meantime, we need to take him to a secure facility." Marcus looked down at Shadow, Nocte, who gazed back at him with those same inscrutable amber eyes. Had the dog known all along that this arrangement was temporary? Had he been waiting patiently to return to his true purpose? Though heartbroken, Marcus realized he needed to return Shadow to his rightful owner. The dog had an important purpose beyond being a family pet. With tremendous difficulty, Marcus knelt beside Shadow one last time. "I guess this is goodbye, buddy," he whispered, running his hand along the dog's sleek coat. "I hope you know we loved having you, even if it was just for a little while." Shadow's expression didn't change, but for a brief moment, Marcus could have sworn the dog leaned slightly into his touch, the first and only display of affection he'd ever shown. The following day, Marcus and his family met Dr. Elena Vasquez at the animal control facility. She was a dignified woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a gentle presence that immediately put them at ease. "Thank you for taking care of Nocte," she said, clasping Marcus' hand warmly. Many would have resisted returning him, especially after forming such a bond. "He was never really ours to keep," Marcus admitted. "I think I always sensed there was something special about him." Annie smiled. "The Xoloitzcuintli were believed by my ancestors to see into the souls of humans. They chose their companions carefully. The fact that Nocte went with you so willingly suggests he saw something worthy in you." The twins were teary-eyed, but fascinated as Dr. Vasquez explained Nocte's importance in preserving Mayan cultural traditions. "He helps people say goodbye to their loved ones," she told them. "He brings comfort to those who are grieving." When it was time for Nocte to leave with Dr. Vasquez, the dog approached each family member in turn, standing before them briefly as if in acknowledgement. With the twins, he allowed a final pat on his head. With Emma, a gentle nudge against her hand. With Marcus, those amber eyes held his gaze one last time, a silent communication between two beings who had briefly walked together. In appreciation for Marcus's cooperation, Dr. Vasquez later sent a substantial reward, along with photos of Nocte participating in cultural events. "He is doing important work," she wrote in her letter. "And in a way, you are now part of that work too." The family eventually adopted a new dog, a boisterous golden retriever puppy who couldn't have been more different from the silent, dignified Nocte. This time they made sure it came with proper documentation, and everyone participated in the decision. Yet sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the moon is full, Marcus finds himself looking out the window, half expecting to see a sleek black silhouette standing in the yard, amber eyes reflecting the moonlight. And he wonders if somewhere, guiding souls between worlds, Nocte sometimes remembers the family who briefly shared his journey. This story reminds us of several important truths. First, appearances can be deceiving. What seems like odd behavior might have deeper significance we don't yet understand. Second, our impulsive decisions, even when well-intentioned, can have unforeseen consequences. Finally, sometimes doing the right thing means letting go of something we love when we realize it belongs elsewhere. Marcus's experience teaches us to be thoughtful before bringing animals into our homes, to properly research their backgrounds, and to recognize when our attachment must yield to a greater purpose. It also reminds us that different cultures view animals in profoundly different ways. What might be simply a pet to one person could be a sacred being to another. Most importantly, Shadow's story shows us that sometimes the most meaningful connections in our lives are temporary. The impact of these brief encounters can transform us, even as we must let go and move forward. Did this story touch your heart? Would you have been able to return Shadow to his rightful owner as Marcus did? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of mystery and cultural discovery, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary stories every week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.